The saddest part was not that her son was gone. It was that she was not allowed to say goodbye. The first drops of rain began falling over the cemetery just as the minister stepped toward the grave. Gray clouds hung low above the rolling hills outside Columbus, Ohio, casting a cold shadow across the gathering of mourners. More than 100 people stood quietly beneath black umbrellas, their faces marked by grief, respect, and disbelief. At the center of it all stood Angela Brooks. Dressed in a simple black funeral dress, she remained beside the polished mahogany casket that held her only son. The wind moved gently through the rows of flowers surrounding the grave. White lilies, roses, and handwritten cards covered nearly every available space. A framed photograph rested near the casket, showing Marcus Brooks smiling beside a lake during a summer afternoon. Looking at that photograph hurt more than Angela could describe. Just 1 week earlier, Marcus had called her after work. He had joked about being hungry and asked whether she still made the best cornbread in Ohio. She had laughed and told him to come over that weekend. Neither of them knew it would be their final conversation. Around the cemetery, friends and family members struggled to hold back tears. Marcus had been only 24 years old, yet the crowd gathered there revealed how deeply he had touched the lives of others. Former teachers stood beside former classmates. Neighbors stood beside co-workers. Children from the community center where Marcus volunteered stood quietly beside their parents. Every person seemed to carry a memory. Every person seemed to have a story. The minister opened his Bible and cleared his throat. The funeral service was finally beginning. A little girl stepped forward holding a single white flower in both hands. She moved slowly toward the casket, preparing to place it beside Marcus's photograph. The cemetery fell silent. Angela closed her eyes. For the first time all day, she felt ready to hear the final words that would lay her son to rest. Then came the sound. At first it was distant, barely noticeable beneath the wind. A faint siren somewhere beyond the hills. Several people glanced toward the entrance before returning their attention to the service. But the sound grew louder and louder. Within seconds, every head turned. 3 police vehicles entered the cemetery gates. Flashing lights reflected across wet pavement and polished headstones. Conversations stopped immediately. The minister lowered his Bible. The little girl froze in place, still holding her flower. Angela slowly opened her eyes. The strange feeling that settled over her was impossible to explain. Not fear, not confusion, something deeper, something that told her this moment did not belong here. The vehicles rolled to a stop less than 50 feet from the gravesite. Doors opened. Uniformed officers stepped out. At their front walked Officer Ryan Mitchell. Tall, professional, and carrying the confidence of a man who believed he was doing exactly what he had been instructed to do. The rain began falling harder as he approached. Family members exchanged worried looks. Reporters who had been standing near the cemetery entrance suddenly lifted cameras. Angela remained beside Marcus's casket. She did not move. Ryan stopped a few feet away. The cemetery seemed to hold its breath. Even the rain felt quieter. "Angela Brooks?" he asked. Angela looked directly at him and nodded once. "Yes." Ryan reached into his jacket and removed a document. His expression remained serious. Around them, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. "Ma'am," he said, "you need to come with us." Gasps spread through the crowd. The little girl lowered her flower. Marcus's grandmother covered her mouth. Angela looked from the officer to her son's casket and then back again. For several long seconds, silence settled across the cemetery like a heavy blanket. And far beyond the mourners, near a black SUV parked at the edge of the road, 2 sharply dressed men watched the scene unfold with expressions that looked far more concerned than surprised. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The rain continued falling softly across the cemetery, creating tiny ripples and puddles between the rows of headstones. Angela Brooks remained beside her son's casket, her eyes fixed on the photograph resting among the flowers. Everything around her seemed distant compared to the grief she had carried since the day Marcus died. 1 week earlier, she had been standing in her kitchen preparing dinner. Marcus was supposed to arrive after work. His favorite cornbread was already in the oven. The dining table had been set for 2. She still remembered smiling when his name appeared on her phone. At the time, she never imagined how precious ordinary moments could become. Since then, every room in her house had transformed into a collection of memories. His coffee mug remained beside the sink. His jacket still hung near the front door. A photograph of him laughing during a family barbecue rested on a bookshelf in the living room. Small things that once felt ordinary now felt impossible to replace. Around the cemetery, family members watched Angela carefully. They knew how much Marcus meant to her. After losing her husband years earlier, Marcus had become the center of her world. Yet he had never belonged only to her. Looking across the crowd gathered beneath umbrellas, Angela could see how many lives he had touched. Former classmates stood beside elderly neighbors. Children from the community center stood quietly with their parents. Several local coaches had returned despite the weather. A retired teacher wiped tears from her eyes. Marcus possessed a rare gift for making people feel valued. He remembered birthdays. He checked on relatives. He volunteered whenever someone needed help. At only 24 years old, he had earned the respect of people twice his age. The minister remained silent near the grave, allowing everyone a moment to absorb what was happening. Marcus's grandmother trembled beneath her umbrella. The little girl holding the white flower looked from Angela to the police officers and back again, unable to understand why a funeral had suddenly become frightening. Officer Ryan Mitchell shifted his weight and glanced toward the growing number of cameras. He could feel the attention of the crowd, yet he forced himself to focus on the assignment he believed had been given for a reason. Earlier that morning, he had reviewed the file multiple times. The instructions had been clear. The urgency had been emphasized. At the station, everything had appeared straightforward. Standing beside a grieving mother felt very different. Across the road, the black SUV remained motionless. Two men inside continued watching the scene. One checked his phone repeatedly. The other stared toward Angela with growing concern. Neither looked surprised. They looked worried. Deeply worried. Back near the casket, Angela finally lifted her eyes toward Ryan. Her voice remained calm despite the pain visible on her face. "Officer," she said softly, "can this wait until my son is buried?" The question drifted through the rain. The crowd fell completely silent. Even the reporters stopped speaking. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire cemetery was waiting for a single answer. Officer Ryan Mitchell held Angela Brooks's gaze for several long seconds before answering. Rain tapped steadily against umbrellas as the entire cemetery waited. "I am sorry for your loss," he said carefully, "but I cannot delay this." A ripple of disbelief moved through the crowd. Marcus's grandmother lowered her head. The minister closed his Bible. The little girl holding the white flower stepped back toward her family, confused by the tension surrounding her. Ryan remained focused on Angela. In his mind, this situation was never personal. It was procedure. It was responsibility. It was what he believed the law required. Earlier that morning, he had arrived at the station before sunrise. A file marked urgent had been waiting on his desk. Several reports had been attached. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Certain recommendations came from people higher in the chain of command. By the time he finished reviewing the material, he believed he understood the situation. He believed immediate action was necessary. Most importantly, he believed he was doing the right thing. Throughout his career, Ryan had learned to trust documentation, trust evidence, trust process. That trust had earned him a reputation for reliability. Supervisors respected him because he followed procedure. Fellow officers respected him because he rarely questioned assignments. In his experience, hesitation created mistakes. Action prevented them. Yet standing in front of Angela Brooks beside her son's casket felt very different from reading a report inside a quiet office. The image before him refused to fit neatly into the conclusions he had already formed. He had expected resistance. He had expected arguments. He had expected someone attempting to avoid questions. Instead, he found a grieving mother standing in the rain beside the final resting place of her only child. Angela remained remarkably calm. Her hands rested gently before her. Her eyes carried exhaustion more than anger. Around them, reporters continued filming. Camera lenses reflected gray clouds and flashing lights. The story was already spreading beyond the cemetery. Ryan knew that. Yet he continued telling himself that public attention could not influence his judgment. The file mattered. The assignment mattered. At least that was what he believed. Nearby, Marcus's grandmother finally spoke. "Please," she whispered, "let her bury her son." The pain in her voice lingered in the cold air. Ryan looked away briefly. He felt the weight of every eye watching him. Still, he remembered the instructions he had received, the urgency that had been emphasized, the expectation that action could not wait. If he walked away now, he feared he would be ignoring a responsibility entrusted to him. Across the road, the men inside the black SUV exchanged worried looks. One reached for his phone and began typing rapidly. The other stared toward the gravesite with increasing concern. Whatever they knew, it was making them nervous. Back near the casket, Angela slowly turned toward Marcus's photograph. Rain droplets clung to the edge of the frame. His smile remained frozen in a happier moment. For a brief second, everything around her seemed to disappear. The police, the cameras, the questions. She remembered Marcus teaching neighborhood children how to fish. She remembered his laugh during family gatherings. She remembered how proud she felt watching him grow into a man respected by everyone who knew him. Then she looked back at Ryan. "You truly believe this cannot wait?" she asked softly. Ryan hesitated for the briefest moment. Then he nodded. "No, ma'am," he replied. "I do not believe it can." The cemetery fell silent again. And at that exact moment, a sharply dressed man carrying a leather briefcase stepped from the black SUV and froze the instant he saw Angela standing beside the casket. The man carrying the leather briefcase moved quickly through the rain, his polished shoes splashing across the wet cemetery path as he crossed the distance between the black SUV and the gravesite. Unlike the reporters who had become energized by the unfolding scene, his attention remained fixed entirely on Angela Brooks. The moment he saw her standing beside Marcus's casket surrounded by police officers, concern flashed across his face. Several mourners stepped aside to let him pass. Officer Ryan Mitchell noticed him immediately. Something about the stranger's urgency felt unusual. He was dressed in an expensive charcoal suit beneath a dark overcoat, the kind often seen inside federal buildings and major courtrooms. Yet his expression carried none of the confidence normally associated with those places. It looked more like alarm. He stopped a few feet from Angela and removed his glasses. Rainwater clung to the lenses. "Mrs. Brooks," he said quietly. Angela looked at him and gave a small nod. "Daniel." The simple exchange immediately caught Ryan's attention. They clearly knew one another. "Who is this?" Ryan asked. The man turned toward him. "Daniel Whitaker." He reached into his coat and briefly displayed identification before returning it to his pocket. Ryan barely glanced at it. His focus remained on the strange reaction Daniel was having to the situation. Daniel looked as though he had arrived moments too late to prevent something important from happening. Around them, cameras continued recording. Reporters whispered to one another. The rain steadily intensified, creating a gray curtain across the cemetery. Marcus's photograph remained beside the casket, partially covered by droplets of water. Daniel glanced toward it and lowered his eyes respectfully before looking back at Angela. "I came as soon as I heard," he said. Angela nodded once. The exhaustion visible on her face seemed heavier than before. "Thank you," she replied softly. Ryan stepped forward. "If you have information relevant to this matter, you may provide it at the station." Daniel stared at him for several seconds. Not angry, not hostile, simply stunned. "At the station?" he repeated. Ryan folded his arms. "Yes." Daniel slowly looked around the cemetery. At the grieving family. At the unfinished funeral. At the little girl still holding the white flower. At the casket waiting beside the open grave. Then he looked back at Ryan. "You chose this moment?" The question carried no accusation. Somehow that made it feel even heavier. Ryan felt irritation rise inside him. "Sir, I am following instructions." Daniel appeared ready to say more, but stopped himself. Whatever thoughts were running through his mind remained unspoken. Across the road, the second man from the SUV stepped outside and began speaking urgently into a phone. His voice could not be heard above the rain, but his body language revealed concern. Back near the gravesite, Marcus's grandmother quietly wept. Family members gathered around her. The little girl tightened her grip on the flower. None of them understood why strangers kept arriving. None of them understood why the funeral seemed to be attracting so much attention. Yet the atmosphere had changed. What began as confusion was becoming something far larger. Angela sensed it too. She glanced briefly toward the road and then back at Daniel. For the first time since arriving, genuine worry crossed his face. The kind of worry that appears when events are moving beyond anyone's control. Moments later, headlights appeared through the rain at the cemetery entrance. Another dark government vehicle turned slowly onto the narrow road leading toward the funeral grounds. Daniel saw it immediately. The color seemed to drain from his face. Under his breath, barely loud enough for anyone else to hear, he whispered 2 words. Too late. The words lingered in the cold rain long after Daniel Whitaker whispered them. Too late. For a moment, nobody understood what he meant. The dark government vehicle continued moving slowly toward the cemetery, its headlights cutting through. The gray afternoon. Water splashed beneath its tires as it rolled past rows of parked cars and stopped near the entrance. Several mourners turned to watch. Reporters immediately lifted their cameras. Even Officer Ryan Mitchell glanced toward the vehicle before returning his attention to Angela Brooks. The funeral seemed trapped between 2 worlds. One was grief. The other was something nobody yet understood. The rear door of the vehicle opened. A distinguished older man stepped out wearing a dark overcoat. He paused briefly beneath the rain before looking directly toward the gravesite. The instant Daniel saw him, his concern deepened. The second man from the SUV lowered his phone and shook his head slowly. Whatever they had hoped to prevent was already happening. Back beside the casket, Angela remained calm. The rain dampened her black dress and gathered along the edges of her sleeves, but she appeared almost unaware of it. Her attention stayed fixed on Marcus's photograph. The smile frozen inside the frame felt painfully alive compared to the silence surrounding her. Ryan cleared his throat. He knew every passing minute made the situation worse. Cameras were recording. The crowd was growing more emotional. Yet his instructions remained unchanged. "Mrs. Brooks," he said carefully, "we need to leave now." A quiet murmur spread through the mourners. Marcus's grandmother lowered her face into trembling hands. Several relatives exchanged frustrated looks. The little girl holding the white flower seemed close to tears. The minister stood motionless beside the grave, unsure whether to continue the service or remain silent. Angela slowly looked toward Ryan. There was no anger in her eyes. No hostility. Only exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes when grief has already taken everything it can take. "May I have 1 minute?" she asked softly. Ryan hesitated. Every instinct told him to allow it. Every human part of him understood the request. But the file waiting in his vehicle, the orders he had been given, and the pressure of responsibility all pushed him in the opposite direction. Finally, he shook his head. The reaction from the crowd was immediate. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a collective sense of heartbreak. Angela looked toward her son's casket once more. Rainwater glistened across the polished wood. White flowers surrounded the grave. Marcus's photograph stood untouched despite the weather. For several seconds, she simply stood there, taking in every detail. Perhaps because she feared she would never have this exact moment again. Then she stepped forward and gently placed her hand on the casket. The cemetery became completely silent. No reporter spoke. No officer moved. Even the wind seemed to fade. Angela lowered her head and whispered a final private goodbye that nobody else could hear. When she lifted her eyes again, tears remained absent. Her dignity remained intact. She straightened her shoulders and turned away from the grave. Marcus's grandmother began quietly crying. The little girl finally placed the white flower beside the photograph. Daniel Whitaker closed his eyes. Across the cemetery, the distinguished man from the government vehicle stopped walking and watched in disbelief. Angela began moving toward the waiting police vehicle. Ryan followed beside her. Behind them remained an unfinished funeral. Ahead waited consequences that none of them could yet see. And as the vehicle door closed behind Angela Brooks, Daniel reached for his phone and spoke the words that would soon change everything. "We have a serious problem," he said. "They have taken her." The drive from the cemetery to downtown Columbus passed in near silence. Rain streamed down the windows of the police vehicle, turning the city outside into blurred streaks of gray and gold. Angela Brooks sat quietly in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap. She did not look at the officers. She did not look at the road ahead. Instead, her eyes rested on the small gold watch around her wrist. Marcus had given it to her 3 years earlier on her birthday. She could still remember his smile when she opened the box. "Now you cannot blame being late on the clock anymore," he had joked. The memory arrived so clearly that she almost heard his voice. She closed her eyes and held on to it for a moment. Back at the cemetery, the funeral remained. Unfinished. The image of Marcus's casket standing alone in the rain refused to leave her mind. Nearly 30 minutes later, the vehicle pulled into the secured parking area behind the police station. News vans were already gathering outside the front entrance. Reporters stood beneath umbrellas speaking into cameras as officers moved through the building. The moment Angela stepped out of the vehicle, dozens of lenses turned toward her. Questions echoed from every direction. Nobody received an answer. Angela simply walked forward with the same calm dignity she had carried through the cemetery. Inside the station, conversations seemed to slow as people noticed her. Officers looked up from their desks. Administrative staff paused in the middle of paperwork. A detective carrying a stack of folders stopped walking entirely. Something about Angela seemed familiar, though few could immediately explain why. Officer Ryan Mitchell noticed the reactions, but pushed them aside. He escorted Angela toward a small interview room near the rear of the building. Upstairs on the third floor, Records Supervisor Harold Benson received a request to verify information connected to the investigation. It was a routine task, one he had performed hundreds of times. Expecting nothing unusual, he logged into the records system and opened the file. Seconds later, his expression changed. Harold leaned closer to the monitor. He blinked. Read the information again. Then a third time. The office around him seemed to disappear. Several classifications appeared at the top of the screen. Federal identifiers, judicial credentials, restricted access notices. Harold frowned. That cannot be right, he whispered. Nearby employees glanced toward him. Harold quickly opened another database. Then another. Every search produced the same result. Every verification matched perfectly. Downstairs, Angela sat alone in the interview room. A narrow window overlooked the rain-soaked parking lot. The ticking wall clock seemed unusually loud. For the first time all day, there were no reporters. No sirens. No cameras. No crowd watching her. Only silence. She rested her hands on the table and stared at the rain sliding down the glass. The quiet gave her room to think about Marcus again. She remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle. She remembered helping him move into his first apartment. She remembered every achievement he celebrated and every disappointment he overcame. A single tear escaped before she gently wiped it away. Upstairs, Harold Benson stared at the screen in disbelief. His hands moved slowly toward the telephone. Whatever he was looking at was far bigger than an ordinary investigation. The implications were impossible to ignore. He dialed a direct internal number and waited. The moment the call connected, he swallowed hard and spoke a sentence that instantly changed the course of the day. You need to come upstairs immediately, he said. Someone has made a very serious mistake. Within 20 minutes, the atmosphere inside the police station changed completely. Supervisors who had been casually reviewing paperwork were suddenly moving through hallways with urgency. Office doors opened. Phones rang. Conversations stopped the moment certain names were mentioned. On the third floor, Harold Benson remained seated in front of his computer, staring at information he still struggled to believe. Every database confirmed the same reality. Every credential matched. Every verification returned identical results. There was no error in the records. The error had happened long before the file ever reached his desk. Downstairs, Officer Ryan Mitchell stood outside the interview room reviewing notes when his phone vibrated. He answered immediately. The conversation lasted less than a minute. As he listened, the confidence on his face slowly disappeared. First came confusion, then disbelief. Finally, concern. That cannot be correct, he said quietly. A pause followed. Are you absolutely certain? Another pause. Ryan glanced through the small glass window in the interview room door. Angela Brooks sat alone at the table, staring at the rain outside. She looked exactly as she had looked at the cemetery. Calm, composed, grieving. Yet suddenly Ryan felt as though he were looking at someone entirely different. Upstairs, the precinct chief entered the records office accompanied by two senior administrators. Harold silently turned the monitor toward them. None of them spoke while reviewing the information. The room seemed to grow quieter with every passing second. One administrator removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another stared at the screen in disbelief. The chief finally exhaled and shook his head. How did this happen? Nobody had an answer. Because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Angela Brooks was not simply a citizen connected to an investigation. She was a sitting federal judge. More than that, she was currently overseeing several major federal cases involving public corruption, government accountability, and financial misconduct. Her rulings were studied across multiple jurisdictions. Her name was recognized throughout federal legal circles. Yet somehow she had been removed from her son's funeral and brought to a police station based on information that now appeared deeply flawed. Outside, additional government vehicles arrived. Men and women in dark business attire entered through secured entrances. Staff members watched from hallways as federal representatives moved directly toward administrative offices. Rumors spread quickly through the building. Nobody wanted to say them aloud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. Someone had made a catastrophic mistake. Ryan finally opened the interview room door and stepped inside. The wall clock continued ticking softly. Rain continued sliding down the window. Angela looked up. For several moments, neither person spoke. Ryan suddenly found it difficult to maintain eye contact. The certainty that had carried him through the cemetery was gone. In its place stood doubt. Angela noticed it immediately. Something changed, she said quietly. It was not a question. Ryan swallowed but said nothing. Before he could respond, the door opened again. 3 federal officials entered the room accompanied by Daniel Whitaker. The moment they saw Angela sitting there, their expressions shifted from concern to disbelief. One of the officials stepped forward immediately. "Judge Brooks," he said. The title seemed to freeze the entire room. Ryan felt every muscle in his body tighten. Daniel lowered his eyes. Angela remained seated, her expression unchanged. The federal official continued speaking. "Judge, we sincerely apologize." Silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind that arrives when assumptions finally collide with reality. And in that moment, Officer Ryan Mitchell realized that the woman he had taken from her son's funeral was not who he believed she was. Worse still, he was beginning to understand that the file he trusted might not have been telling the truth at all. The room remained silent long after the federal official spoke. Rain continued sliding down the window behind Angela Brooks, tracing slow paths through the gray afternoon light. Nobody seemed eager to break the silence. The revelation had changed everything. Officer Ryan Mitchell stood near the door, staring at the floor. The confidence that had guided him throughout the day was gone. In its place was a growing realization that he had never fully understood the situation standing before him. Angela slowly rose from her chair. The federal officials immediately stepped aside. Not because of her title, not because of her position, but because of the quiet dignity she carried even now. Daniel Whitaker looked at her with concern. "Judge Brooks, transportation is ready whenever you are." Angela nodded, but remained where she was. Her eyes settled on Ryan. The officer finally looked up. For the first time since arriving at the cemetery, he seemed unsure of what to say. "Judge Brooks," he began. The words felt awkward, formal, inadequate. He stopped. Angela waited patiently. Around them, nobody spoke. Ryan drew a slow breath. "I believed I was doing my job." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I believed the information I was given." Angela listened without interruption. One of the federal officials quietly folded his hands. Daniel remained still beside the doorway. Ryan glanced briefly toward the rain-covered window before continuing. "When I arrived at the cemetery, I saw a file." He swallowed hard. "I saw instructions." His eyes returned to Angela. "I did not see a mother." The admission settled heavily over the room. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. Nobody attempted to defend him, because everyone understood the truth hidden inside those words. Angela remained quiet for several moments. Then she spoke softly. "That happens more often than people realize." Ryan lowered his eyes. Earlier that afternoon, he had been certain. Certain about the file. Certain about the urgency. Certain about his authority. Now all of that certainty seemed painfully fragile. Upstairs, investigators had already begun reviewing the records that triggered the entire chain of events. Preliminary findings suggested that critical information had been omitted before the file reached local authorities. Important context had never been forwarded. The information Ryan trusted had not told the full story. Yet none of that mattered most to Angela. Her thoughts remained focused on Marcus. His funeral. His unfinished farewell. She looked toward Daniel. "How much time has passed?" Daniel checked his watch. "Less than 3 hours." Relief briefly crossed Angela's face. The service could still continue. Her son could still be laid to rest properly. Ryan stepped forward slightly. "Judge Brooks." She turned toward him. He struggled to find the right words. Then he finally spoke the simplest truth available. "I am sorry." No excuses followed. No explanations. No attempts to justify what had happened. Just those 2 words. Angela studied him carefully. The room waited. Then she gave a small nod. "Learn from it." Ryan blinked. Ma'am. Angela glanced toward the rain beyond the glass. The law matters, she said quietly. But people matter too. The words settled over the room like a final judgment. Not one delivered from a courtroom bench. One delivered from experience, grief, and wisdom. Daniel lowered his eyes. Even the federal officials seemed affected by the moment. Angela then reached for her coat and moved toward the door. The representatives stepped aside. Ryan remained where he was, watching her leave. For the first time that day, he understood that the greatest mistake had not been trusting the wrong file. The greatest mistake had been forgetting to see the human being standing in front of him. By the time Angela Brooks returned to the cemetery, the storm had almost completely passed. The dark clouds that had dominated the afternoon were drifting slowly toward the horizon, allowing warm streaks of sunlight to break through the sky above the rolling hills outside Columbus. The air smelled of wet grass and fresh earth. Rain still clung to the branches of the oak trees surrounding the cemetery, and small droplets shimmered on rows of polished headstones. The chaos that had interrupted the day was gone. The reporters had disappeared. The flashing lights were gone. The noise had faded. What remained was what should have been there from the beginning. Family. Memory. Farewell. As Angela stepped onto the cemetery path, she saw familiar faces waiting quietly near the gravesite. Marcus's grandmother sat beneath a large umbrella surrounded by relatives. Friends from the community had returned after hearing that the service would continue. Several people who had already left earlier in the afternoon had come back. Nobody wanted Marcus's story to end with confusion. They wanted it to end with love. When they saw Angela approaching, nobody rushed toward her. Nobody asked questions. They simply made room for her to return to where she belonged. The minister stepped forward and removed his hat. "We waited for you," he said softly. Angela nodded. For a moment she could not speak. Her eyes moved toward the casket. It remained exactly where she had left it. Marcus's photograph still rested beside the flowers. The little white flower carried by the young girl had finally been placed beside the frame. The sight nearly brought tears to Angela's eyes. She walked slowly through the wet grass until she reached the casket. Every step felt lighter than the ones she had taken earlier that afternoon. Not because her grief had disappeared. It had not. The loss of Marcus would remain with her forever. But the confusion, humiliation, and interruption that had stolen part of this day no longer stood between them. She rested her hand gently on the polished wood. The evening sunlight touched her face. Around her, the cemetery became perfectly still. The minister reopened his Bible. Family members gathered closer. The service resumed from the exact place where it had been interrupted. This time there were no sirens. No questions. No distractions. One by one, people shared memories of Marcus. A former student spoke about how Marcus had encouraged him during a difficult year. A neighbor remembered Marcus helping repair a broken porch without ever being asked. A childhood friend smiled through tears while recalling summer fishing trips along Lake Erie. Every story painted the same picture. Marcus had lived a life that mattered. Angela listened carefully to each memory. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes tears filled her eyes. Each story felt like a gift. A reminder that while her son was gone, the kindness he left behind remained alive in countless people. As the sun moved lower across the horizon, the service slowly came to an end. Family members approached the grave one final time, placing flowers beside the casket. Eventually, only Angela remained standing there. In her hand rested a single white rose. She looked down at Marcus's photograph and smiled softly. "You made this world better," she whispered. Then she placed the rose beside the casket. A gentle breeze moved through the trees overhead. Golden light spread across the cemetery. In the distance, birds returned to their nests as evening settled across the hillside. Far back along the cemetery path, Officer Ryan Mitchell stood quietly beside his vehicle. He did not approach. He did not interrupt. He simply watched from a respectful distance. Angela never turned around, but somehow she seemed to know he was there. The silence between them no longer carried conflict, only understanding. The storm was gone. The truth had been revealed. And beneath the final light of day, a mother was finally allowed to say goodbye to her son.